My name is Ibrahim Traore. I speak to you not first as a president, not as a soldier, not as a symbol placed on banners or headlines, but as a man who reached a point of exhaustion so deep that even silence became heavy. Power is loud, responsibility is louder. Every decision carries faces you will never meet and consequences you may never fully see. There are nights when sleep does not come because every choice feels incomplete, every solution imperfect. You sign papers knowing that whatever you choose, someone will be disappointed, someone will suffer, someone will say you chose wrong. Over time, that weight does not rest on the shoulders. It settles in the chest. I had reached such a night. I was tired not only of governing, but of being seen as someone who must always be certain. I was tired of strength being confused with hardness. I was tired of being spoken to as a title instead of as a soul. And most of all, I was tired of the quiet fear that comes when a leader wonders whether he is slowly losing the ability to feel. That night, I did not pray with words. I did not ask for guidance in the way people expect leaders to ask. I simply lay down, carrying questions that had no sentences, questions about conscience, questions about whether authority can survive humility, questions about whether God still speaks to those surrounded by walls and guards and rituals. And then I fell asleep. What followed did not feel like escape. It did not feel like imagination. It felt like being stopped. I want to be clear with you, especially those who believe deeply and those who doubt deeply. I am not telling this story to impress you. I am telling it because it unsettled me, because it stripped something away that I did not know I was protecting. In that sleep, I was not a president. I was not a commander. I was simply myself, without advisors, without applause, without excuses. And in that place, where power had no language, my conscience finally did. That is where the dream began. And before I speak of what I saw, you must understand why it mattered. A dream only changes a man if it meets him where he is weakest. Mine met me where I was most guarded. This is not a story about authority. It is a story about what remains when authority falls silent. He appeared without ceremony. There was no sky opening, no thunder, no crowd, no light that demanded attention. He did not arrive the way power arrives in the world. He was already there, as if he had been waiting long before I noticed him. He stood close, not close enough to intimidate, not far enough to feel symbolic, close in the way a person stands when they know you, when they do not need to introduce themselves. It was Jesus Christ. I did not ask how I knew. Recognition did not come from the mind. It came from something older, quieter, something that does not argue. He did not sit on a throne. There was no crown, no sign of command. His clothes were ordinary. His hands were empty. His posture was relaxed, almost weary, like someone who has walked a long way and learned patience along the road. I searched his face for judgment, because that is what leaders expect. When you hold authority, you learn to brace yourself. Praise feels suspicious, criticism feels inevitable, silence feels dangerous. But his eyes carried none of that. They did not accuse me. They did not congratulate me. They did not even question me in the way people question leaders, looking for weakness or contradiction. They simply saw me, and that, I realized, was why I felt exposed. In the dream, I did not feel fear. That surprised me. I have felt fear on battlefields, in negotiation rooms, in moments when history narrowed into a single decision. But this was different. Fear usually comes from threat. This came from recognition. I felt shame, not the shame of being caught in wrongdoing, but the deeper shame of being known without defense. The kind of shame that arises when all the explanations you tell yourself fall apart, and what remains is the truth you have been avoiding. He did not speak. That silence was not empty. It was heavy with meaning. It carried a question without forming one. And somehow, I understood that the question was not about my leadership, my strategy, or my success. It was about my conscience. In that moment, I understood something that unsettled me deeply. He had not come to discuss power at all. He had come to ask whether power had changed who I was becoming. Leaders often confuse responsibility with righteousness. We tell ourselves that difficult decisions excuse emotional distance. We say hardness is necessary. We say sacrifice means others must suffer first. Over time, these explanations become armor. Standing before him, that armor felt unnecessary, and without it I could feel its weight for the first time. His gaze moved slowly, not over my body, but through memories, moments I had justified, words I had chosen carefully, silences I had allowed to protect order, compromises I had called realism. None of these were condemned, none were defended. They were simply present. I realized then that he was not there to take power from me. He was there to reveal what power had taken from me without my noticing. The world teaches leaders to speak constantly, to define, to respond, to explain. But his silence taught me something more uncomfortable. That a man's true condition is revealed when no one demands an answer. I wanted him to speak. I wanted instruction, affirmation, even correction, something that would let me act without uncertainty. That is what leaders crave most, clarity that absolves responsibility. But he did not give it. Instead, his presence invited me to listen inward, to the part of myself I had learned to silence because it complicated command, the part that feels before it calculates, the part that recognizes suffering before it measures cost. I understood then why I felt shame. Not because I was evil, not because I had failed absolutely, but because I had allowed necessity to dull compassion and had called it maturity. His eyes reflected something I had not expected: patience. Not patience with injustice, but patience with people, with their slowness, with their contradictions, with their need to be seen as human before being organized as citizens. That patience confronted me more sharply than anger ever could. In that gaze, I understood that conscience is not loud. It does not compete with ambition. It waits, and when it finally speaks, it does so not to command, but to remind. I did not kneel in the dream. No physical gesture was required. Something inside me had already lowered itself. And I understood clearly, without words, that he was not asking what I had built. He was asking who I had become while building it. That realization stayed with me long after the image faded. It stayed because it was not dramatic. It was intimate. And intimacy, for a leader, is the most disarming force of all. The dream did not begin with a miracle. It began with recognition. And recognition, I learned, is where transformation always starts. Without warning, the space around us changed. It did not change the way dreams usually do, with confusion or distortion. It unfolded slowly, like a curtain being drawn back by steady hands. I was no longer standing in that quiet closeness alone. I was seeing my country, not as a map, not as borders, not as reports or statistics. I saw people. I saw villages without fear in their evenings. I saw children walking without being counted or categorized. I saw elders speaking without their voices, being treated as obstacles to progress. The land looked familiar, yet softened, as if time itself had learned patience. It was not paradise. I understood that immediately. There were still worn roads, still arguments, still hunger in some places, still grief that had not yet found healing. This was not a fantasy designed to seduce belief. It was something far more demanding. It was peace without illusion. People looked at one another without suspicion, not because they were perfect, but because trust had returned enough to breathe. The poor were not hidden, but neither were they pitied. They were present, seen, accounted for without being reduced. The strong did not dominate, the capable did not exploit. Leadership existed, but it did not tower. It stood among. I felt something tighten in my chest. This was the future I had spoken about in speeches. The future we describe with confident language and timelines. Yet seeing it stripped of slogans, I understood how fragile it truly was. Then something happened that I struggled to describe with precision. He did not speak, not with words, but a knowing passed through me, as clear as any sentence. This future does not arrive by itself. It does not grow naturally from ambition. It does not emerge from plans alone. It does not obey ideology or force. It is built, and the cost of building it is not paid by the masses first. It is paid by the conscience of those who lead. I understood then that a good future is not created by grand declarations. It is created by repeated acts that bruise the ego, acts that require bending, listening, delaying, admitting uncertainty. We speak often about sacrifice, but we rarely specify who must sacrifice first. In that vision, I saw something unsettling. The future depended less on what leaders demanded and more on what they were willing to relinquish. Relinquish certainty. Relinquish distance, relinquish the illusion that authority places a man above correction. I noticed something else. In that future, no one spoke my name with reverence. No statues, no slogans, no chants. And strangely, that brought relief. Because the future was not built around a man, it was built around dignity. I felt an impulse rise within me to claim this vision, to promise it, to declare that I would deliver it. That reflex is familiar to leaders. We are trained to turn vision into ownership. But before that impulse could settle, another understanding followed. This future cannot be commanded into existence. It can only be invited. Invited through actions that feel small, almost invisible. Actions that will never trend. Actions that require proximity to suffering without the shield of ceremony. The future he showed me was not waiting for stronger laws, it was waiting for softer hearts. I thought of all the times I had spoken about reform, about justice, about national rebirth. None of those words were false. But in that moment, I saw how incomplete they were when disconnected from humility. The future did not accuse me. It challenged me. It asked a question that no policy document ever asks. Are you willing to lower yourself enough for others to rise without fear? I realized then that a good future is not measured by outcomes alone. It is measured by the moral posture of those who guide it. When the vision faded, I felt no triumph. I felt responsibility deepen. Because once you see what could be, you can no longer pretend that convenience is neutrality. And I understood something that has not left me since. A better future is not built by leaders who speak well. It is built by leaders who are willing to kneel when no one is watching. The command did not arrive like a decree. There was no urgency in it, no tone of threat, no promise of reward. It came with the quiet firmness of something that does not need persuasion, because it rests on truth. He did not ask me to build a church. He did not instruct me to draft new laws, or announce reforms, or stand before cameras and speak of faith. He did not request symbols. He did not demand public gestures that could be applauded or debated. Instead, the instruction was almost unbearable in its simplicity. When you wake, you and the other leaders go from house to house and wash the feet of the poor. I remember the moment clearly, because my first reaction was not spiritual. It was practical resistance. My mind immediately searched for alternatives, for interpretations, for metaphors. Leaders are skilled at turning uncomfortable clarity into manageable symbolism. We ask whether something is figurative because we hope it is. But this was not a metaphor. Foot washing is not poetic. It is not efficient. It does not scale. It cannot be delegated without losing its meaning. It is slow. It is intimate. It places the one who washes lower than the one who receives. It is the work of the least. And that was precisely why it struck fear into me. I thought of the risks, the optics, the misunderstandings, the accusations of performance or weakness. I thought of security concerns. I thought of dignity my own, and that of those around me. And then I understood the deeper reason for my hesitation. This act produced no power. It did not strengthen authority. It did not project control. It did not allow distance. It offered no protection. It required presence. It required kneeling. It required touching what leaders are trained to avoid: the physical reality of poverty, the smell of labor, the vulnerability of proximity. In my life, I had knelt before maps, before plans, before strategy tables. I had knelt in private prayer. But this was different. This kneeling would be public but not ceremonial, visible but not glorious, witnessed but not staged. It would strip away the separation that makes leadership manageable. The instruction did not come with reassurance. There was no promise that people would understand, no guarantee of gratitude, no assurance of success. Only this: do it. And in that moment, I felt the full weight of leadership collapse into a single question. Am I willing to lower myself without knowing what will rise in return? We speak often of serving the people. We repeat the phrase until it loses meaning. But service, real service, always involves discomfort. It always costs something internal before it costs anything external. I realized then that this act was not for the poor. It was for us. Because power has a way of bending language while keeping posture upright. It allows us to speak of humility without practicing it. To speak of sacrifice while remaining untouched. This command cut through that illusion. It demanded action without control over outcome. It demanded obedience without explanation. I understood then why no cameras were mentioned, why no speeches were required, why no institutions were involved. Because the act itself was the message. And it terrified me more than any enemy ever had. The dream did not end there. But the moment I woke, I knew something with absolute clarity. If I refused to obey this instruction, everything I had seen before would dissolve into memory without consequence. The vision of a good future would become just another comforting image. The presence I had felt would fade into story. The dream would die the moment I chose comfort over conscience. And so, before I even stood up from my bed, I understood something that no briefing had ever taught me. The hardest commands are never those that ask us to act boldly. They are those that ask us to kneel quietly. What happened afterward was not dramatic in the way stories are usually told. There was no sudden applause, no collective awakening, no declaration that history had shifted in a single afternoon. If anything, what followed was quieter than I expected, and because of that, it was more unsettling. When we arrived, we did not announce ourselves. There were no speeches explaining why we had come, no words prepared to protect intention. We simply entered homes as guests, not as officials. The rooms were small, the floors were worn. The air carried the weight of lives lived without insulation from hardship. We knelt, and when we did, something unexpected occurred. The people did not look at our hands, they looked at our faces. That moment changed everything. I had imagined that washing feet would be humiliating for us, that it would expose our authority, that it would reduce us in the eyes of those we served, but that is not what happened. Instead, it revealed us. Some pulled their feet away instinctively, not out of defiance but out of embarrassment. They did not believe this gesture was meant for them. Years of being unseen had taught them to distrust attention, especially when it came from those in power. Some began to cry without sound, not the kind of tears that ask for help, but the kind that come when dignity is suddenly acknowledged after long absence. Some whispered a single question. That question struck deeper than any accusation ever could. Why would those who govern kneel? Why would those who command lower themselves? Why would those who usually speak choose silence? And as I looked into their eyes, I understood something with painful clarity. We were not washing feet. We were washing away distance. Distance between ruler and citizen. Distance between decision and consequence. Distance between comfort and suffering. Power survives on distance. It needs separation to remain efficient. When distance collapses, power becomes accountable to humanity. As we knelt, I felt something dissolve inside me. The mental categories I had relied on, beneficiaries, populations, sectors, fell apart. In their place were faces, names, stories I would never forget. A man who had worked since childhood and still slept hungry some nights. A woman who had lost 2 sons and never asked for recognition. An elder who had stopped expecting anything from leaders decades ago. None of them asked for explanation. They did not demand answers. They did not accuse. They simply watched us, as if measuring whether this moment would disappear as quickly as it arrived. I realized then that the poor do not doubt our intelligence. They doubt our presence. They have heard promises before. They have survived reforms that never reached their doorsteps. They have learned that words travel faster than compassion. Kneeling interrupted that pattern. It slowed everything down. It forced us to remain in the moment long enough for something real to happen. And that is when I understood the true danger of this act. Once distance is removed, you can no longer retreat into abstraction. Once you kneel before someone, you cannot later speak of them as a problem to be managed. You carry their face into every decision. I felt the ground beneath my knees. I felt the strain in my back. I felt the unfamiliar stillness of not leading, not directing, not shaping outcome. And in that stillness, something shifted. The poor were no longer recipients of policy. They were witnesses. Witnesses to whether we meant what we said when we spoke of service. Witnesses to whether humility was real or rehearsed. When we finished, no one clapped. No one followed us out. Life resumed, quietly, cautiously. But something had already happened that could not be reversed. We had crossed a line that leaders rarely cross. And once crossed, it changes how you stand forever. After we finished, I waited for requests. That expectation revealed more about me than about them. I assumed that once the distance was gone, once dignity had been acknowledged, there would be demands, that someone would ask for money, for favors, for promises written down and guaranteed, that the moment would turn transactional, because that is how power usually works. But no one asked for anything, not a coin, not a job, not a connection. Instead, something far more unsettling happened. They prayed. Some prayed aloud, others whispered words only their own hearts could hear. Some placed their hands together awkwardly, uncertain, as if prayer itself had become unfamiliar after years of neglect. But the direction of those prayers was clear. They prayed for us. They prayed that we would not forget them again. They prayed that when we returned to offices and meetings and guarded rooms, we would remember what it felt like to kneel. They prayed that our hearts would remain soft when power demanded hardness. I stood there, unable to move, because I realized how little I had prepared myself for this. I had prepared myself to give. I had not prepared myself to receive. Their prayers were not sentimental. They were not dramatic. They were precise, almost surgical, aimed directly at the most fragile part of leadership. Memory. The poor understand something many leaders forget. Forgetting is not an accident. It is a habit. They did not pray for wealth. They did not pray for miracles. They prayed for our conscience to survive success. And that broke something open in me. I had spent years believing that poverty was primarily a lack of resources. Standing there, I understood how incomplete that belief was. Poverty is also the experience of being unseen long enough to expect nothing. Their restraint was not weakness. It was dignity preserved through endurance. In that moment, I saw clearly that the poor were not waiting for saviors. They were waiting for presence that lasted beyond symbolism. Their prayers were not for change imposed from above. They were for fidelity from those entrusted with power. One man's voice trembled as he spoke. He did not look at me, he looked at the floor. He asked God to help us remain human. That request pierced deeper than any political critique ever had, because power has a way of reshaping identity quietly. It replaces listening with deciding. It replaces empathy with efficiency. It replaces faces with figures. And here were those who lived with the consequences of our decisions, asking only that we not lose ourselves. I realized then that the poor do not lack dignity. They lack our sustained attention. They do not need to be elevated to feel valuable. They need to be acknowledged as already valuable. Their prayers carried a trust that was almost painful. Trust that this moment was not another performance. Trust that kneeling meant something beyond that day. As they prayed, I felt smaller than I ever had in public life. Not diminished, but reduced to my essential self. A man accountable not only for outcomes, but for inner posture. When we finally stood to leave, there was no sense of completion, no closure. The prayers followed us out, invisible but heavy. I knew then that those prayers would judge every future decision I made, not with condemnation, with memory. And memory, once awakened, does not allow convenient forgetfulness. I watched men kneel who had never knelt before anyone, men who had issued commands that moved thousands, men whose voices had silenced rooms, men trained to stand firm, to project certainty, to never show hesitation in public. That day, they lowered themselves slowly, not as an act of ritual, not because someone instructed them how, but because something inside them gave way. Some hesitated before bending their knees. I could see it in their bodies. The instinct to remain upright fought quietly against the weight of the moment. Pride does not leave easily. It resists with habit, not argument. And yet, they knelt. What surprised me most was not that they knelt, but that some of them could not stand back up right away. Their hands rested on their thighs, their heads remained lowered longer than necessary, not because they were tired, but because something had broken open inside them. This was not humiliation. It was exposure. Power teaches men to armor themselves emotionally, to replace vulnerability with control, to believe that being unyielding is the same as being strong. Over time, that armor becomes so familiar that removing it feels dangerous. Kneeling stripped that armor away. I saw it in their eyes. The moment when old self-respect built on command and distance cracked, not shattered violently, but fractured quietly, making room for something long neglected. They were not weak in that moment. They were honest. And honesty, I learned, requires more courage than authority ever does. Some of these men had ordered troops into danger. Some had negotiated with forces that did not value life. Some had survived betrayal and learned to trust no one fully. And yet, none of those experiences had prepared them for this. Because kneeling before the poor does not allow strategy. It does not allow calculation. It does not allow control over interpretation. You cannot kneel halfway. You cannot kneel symbolically. Either your body lowers or it does not. And when the body lowers, the mind follows. I felt something shift among us as leaders. The air changed. Conversation stopped. Rank dissolved. Titles became irrelevant. In that posture, we were not commanders or officials. We were men asking, without words, to be forgiven for the distance we had allowed to grow. I understood then that kneeling does not erase authority. It redefines it. Authority that cannot kneel becomes tyranny over time. Authority that can kneel remains accountable to its source. One of the men beside me whispered something I will never forget. His voice was almost ashamed. I forgot what this feels like. He did not explain what he meant. He did not need to. He meant the feeling of being equal to another human being without leverage, the feeling of existing without advantage, the feeling of being seen not as a role but as a soul. That is what kneeling restored. When we finally stood, none of us stood the same way we had before. Our backs were straighter, but our posture was different, less rigid, less defended. I realized then that humility does not weaken leadership. It cleans it. It removes the residue that accumulates when power is exercised without reflection. It reminds leaders that authority is borrowed, not owned. And that reminder stays in the body longer than it stays in the mind. That day, the strongest leaders did not lose anything by kneeling. They recovered something they did not know they had lost. Their humanity. No document was signed that day. There was no announcement, no decree, no press release carefully shaped to control interpretation. If someone had asked what policy emerged from that moment, the honest answer would have been none. And yet, everything began to change. The change did not start in institutions. It started in how we spoke when no one was listening, in how we paused before making decisions that once felt automatic, in how certain words suddenly felt too light to carry human weight. Before that day, we spoke about the poor in numbers, percentages, projections, targets, risk assessments. Those words are not wrong. They are necessary, but they are dangerous when they become substitutes for memory. After that day, numbers acquired faces. Every time a report crossed my desk, I saw a pair of feet, a cracked heel, a trembling hand, a face that had looked at me without expectation and offered prayer instead of demand. That memory changed the speed of my decisions, not slower in the sense of indecision, but slower in the sense of care. I no longer rushed past questions that once felt inconvenient. I no longer dismissed hesitation as weakness. I learned to sit with discomfort long enough to understand what it was asking of me. This is something law cannot do. Law can regulate behavior. Law can punish injustice. Law can create structure. But law cannot create conscience. Conscience is formed in moments of encounter, in moments where abstraction collapses and responsibility becomes personal. No statute can force that. No reform can guarantee it. I understood then why so many societies pass good laws and remain broken. Because brokenness is rarely legal. It is moral. We often believe that if we change the system, people will change. But systems are built by people whose inner posture determines how those systems are used. That day did not give us new rules. It gave us a new lens. We stopped speaking about the poor as a category that needed managing. We began speaking about them as neighbors whose absence from our awareness was a failure of leadership. This did not make decisions easier. In fact, it made them harder. Because conscience complicates efficiency, it interrupts convenience, it demands explanation when shortcuts appear harmless. I noticed it in meetings. A pause where there used to be momentum. A question asked where silence once passed unnoticed. A willingness to reconsider not because something was illegal, but because something felt wrong. This is how real change begins. Not with applause, not with slogans, not with promises that can be postponed, but with a quiet refusal to proceed without remembering who bears the cost. I learned that day that law changes societies, yes, but conscience changes people. And when people change, societies follow slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. The world often demands immediate results. Leaders are judged by visible outcomes, but the most important changes are often invisible at first. They happen in how a man holds authority when no one is watching. That day, nothing changed on paper, but something irreversible changed within us. And that, I have come to believe, is the only kind of change that lasts. I woke suddenly. My heart was racing, my body was cold, as if I had been standing outside for a long time. The room was quiet, unchanged, ordinary. There were no signs left behind, no light, no sound, no proof. And yet, I knew. I knew with a certainty that did not feel emotional but moral. This dream was not given to be narrated. It was given to be lived. That understanding arrived before any interpretation, before any attempt to explain what had happened, before any desire to share it with others. I understood that the moment I turned the dream into a story without turning it into action, it would lose all meaning. There are dreams that comfort us, and there are dreams that judge us. This one did not ask whether I believed. It asked whether I would obey. I lay there, staring into the dark, and I felt the temptation rise quickly. The temptation to keep this experience private and symbolic. The temptation to tell myself that intention was enough. That reflection itself was already a form of obedience. But I knew better. Leaders are skilled at converting conviction into language. We speak of values, of inspiration, of lessons learned. We give interviews. We frame experiences carefully so that they cost us nothing. This dream resisted that. It demanded risk. Not the kind of risk that earns admiration, but the kind that exposes misunderstanding. The risk of being mocked, the risk of being misinterpreted, the risk of losing control over narrative. I understood then that the dream would only remain alive if I treated it as real. Not emotionally real, practically real. I speak now at the end, not because the story is finished, but because responsibility requires voice. I speak to Muslims and Christians, to believers and skeptics, to leaders of the Sahel, to Africa, and to the wider world, especially to those who have lived long enough to know that history repeats itself not because people forget facts, but because they forget conscience. What I experienced did not make me holy. It did not make me certain. It did not remove doubt from my leadership or pain from my decisions. What it did was simpler, and therefore more demanding. It reminded me that power without humility becomes noise, that faith without action becomes decoration, that leadership without memory becomes danger. The world today is loud with certainty. Everyone is convinced they are right. Nations shout, ideologies harden, people retreat into camps where listening is replaced by labeling. In such a world, conscience becomes inconvenient. Africa knows this too well. We have been studied, divided, corrected, rescued, abandoned, and rediscovered many times. Too often, decisions about our future were made far from our suffering. Too often, leadership, our own and others, forgot that authority is not ownership. I speak also to myself, because the temptation to forget never disappears. It returns quietly, wearing the clothes of urgency. It tells leaders that there is no time to kneel, no time to listen, no time to remain human. That is the most dangerous lie power tells. To my brothers and sisters of faith, I say this: God is not impressed by our words about him. He is revealed in how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. Prayer that does not soften the heart eventually hardens it. To my fellow leaders, especially those who command force or influence, I offer no accusation, only a warning born of experience. If you cannot kneel without losing your identity, then your identity is built on something fragile. Strength that fears humility is already weakening. To the elderly who listen with long memory, I honor you. You know that civilizations do not fall first through invasion, but through indifference. Through leaders who stop seeing faces and start seeing only outcomes. The poor do not ask for perfection. They ask not to be forgotten. And forgetting, once normalized, becomes policy. I do not claim that one act changed everything. I do not claim that kneeling solved injustice. But I know this with certainty. It changed how I carry authority. And how a leader carries authority matters more than how loudly he speaks. If there is a call in this story, it is not dramatic. It is not revolutionary in the way headlines prefer. It is simply this: return. Return to conscience. Return to humility. Return to the discipline of lowering oneself before judging others. This is not weakness, it is alignment. I wish peace for the world, not the peace of silence imposed by force, but the peace that comes when dignity is no longer negotiated. I wish Africa a future built not on imitation, but on integrity, not on resentment, but on responsibility. And I wish myself the courage to remember on days when memory is inconvenient that leadership is not proven by how high one stands, but by how willingly one kneels. Let me end with this affirmation, not as a slogan, but as a responsibility spoken aloud. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. I bear witness before God and humanity that what I have shared is true. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. I speak these words not for praise, but because truth obliges me. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. These words are not fiction, not performance, not strategy. They are truth as I have lived it. If this story has stirred something in you, do not admire it. Examine yourself, and if you wish to continue walking with these reflections, to listen, to question, to remember together, stay close, remain present. That, more than any gesture, keeps conscience alive. If I acted as though what I had seen required embodiment, if I accepted that faith when it is authentic, always asks for movement in the body, not just agreement in the mind, I realized something else, quietly, almost painfully. God was not asking how much I believed. He was asking how low I was willing to go. Belief can remain abstract. It can exist comfortably within words. But humility is physical. It requires posture. It requires proximity. It requires choosing closeness where distance once protected you. That morning, I did not feel exalted. I felt accountable. Accountable not to public opinion, not to ideology, not even to history as it is usually written, but to a truth I could no longer unsee. I knew that if I failed to act, the dream would not disappear. It would return as regret, as restlessness, as a quiet erosion of integrity that no success could compensate for. So I stood up, not with clarity about how everything would unfold, not with certainty that others would follow, not with assurance that the act would be understood, only with the knowledge that obedience does not require explanation to be valid, and that sometimes the most sacred moments are not those we speak about, but those we carry silently into action. The dream did not ask me to change the world overnight. It asked me to change my posture toward it. And that, I understood, was where everything truly begins.